We're going to get started. There might be some people rolling in, but we'll get started in the interest of time. Thanks for coming. I'd like to welcome you all to this event. We're fortunate today to have Kathy Overson and Victor Benassi from the University of New Hampshire here to talk. Kathy's currently the interim director for the Center for Teaching and Learning. We have a new name now, right? What's your name now? Center for Excellence in Teaching and Learning. So, I was going to say that's your name. Anyway, so Kathy's the interim director for their center, and they have an interesting model for their center that I think you'll get a flavor for when they talk today. And then Victor is the former director, and Victor, for those of you who don't know, Victor was actually my professor in graduate school. He taught my seminar on practicum in teaching psychology in 1992. So I had the opportunity to learn from Victor, who has done an extensive work in teaching and learning over the last 70 years, Victor? 60 years, something like that? Last 30, 40 years. I'm just pleased to have him here and to learn about what they have to say today, which is really about one way to begin to think about how we can create opportunities for our students to learn by creating experiences that really sort of drive them towards learning effectively. So I'm going to turn it over to them, and thanks.
Thanks. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for coming. So as Chris said, we have a teaching and learning center at UNH, and we do all the usual things that teaching and learning centers do with faculty and teaching graduate students, and we provide consultation services. We have lots of resources that are available. We offer workshops of many different kinds. We sometimes have conferences and so on. But what I would say is the distinctive feature of our center is that we have an approach to working with faculty to develop interventions in their courses that are informed by the science of learning. So, Catherine and I are both psychologists. Neither of us, in terms of our basic education in that area, is related to science of learning, but something we've developed in different ways over the years. Our basic approach is that we put out a call to faculty at our institution, and we tell them that we're interested in working with faculty on some educational interventions that might be helpful and useful to them in their work with students in their courses, either in class or out of class, either face-to-face or online or hybrid. And then what we do is we meet with those faculty and we identify with them a learning issue that they want to work on, and then we work further with them to try to crystallize that topic into one or more learning outcomes. We then, because we're so heavily focused on assessment, is that we then think about what kinds of assessment might be appropriate to assess that or those learning outcomes. And then, perhaps most importantly, we develop an intervention to try to facilitate the acquisition of that outcome. And the way that we do this as experimental psychologists is we do studies. We call them projects, but they're experiments, is what they are. They're experiments in which we compare the impact of our intervention with some control condition. And often that control condition is either what they as teachers usually do normally in their course, and or what would be what students would do on their own for, say, preparing for an exam, something like that. So that's the basic approach of the center. So we'll acknowledge the contribution here of several folks and entities that we've been supported over the last decade by the Davis Educational Foundation. This is our, we just started, as you've just started, a new Davis Educational Grant. We just started a Davis Educational Grant in December, which is our fourth one. We've also had wonderful support from the Provost Office and Academic Affairs for the whole time that the center has been in existence, which is in the early 1990s. And special thanks, these are not particular names here, but we thank the faculty and teaching graduate students and the students in the courses where we've done our work. So basic principle. Most students believe that repeated study, rereading of course material is more effective exam preparation strategy than being tested on that material. At lunch today with some psychology folks, I mentioned that there is an ongoing study by Andy Butler, who was working at the University of Texas, and among other things that they've done is they've done an assessment of senior high school students, 6,000 of them so far, or at least back in September it was 6,000. And they asked them a variety of questions, and one of them is that what study strategy or strategies do you use to prepare for your examinations and assessments in high school? And what they found was that a strong majority of the students identified one strategy that they used. And of those that identified one strategy, the majority of them picked one strategy. And that one strategy was rereading the material. You read it, you don't understand it, you read it again. And Mark McDaniel from Washington University and Callender published a paper not too long ago in which they compared reading textbook material 1 time, 2 times, 3 times to see if there was any benefit of rereading material on either low stakes or high stakes exam after they've completed the reading. The way I like to describe it is there was one of their studies or conditions in which rereading the material had a benefit. There was one study where rereading the material actually had a significant effect, but in the opposite direction. And there were a whole bunch of other conditions in the paper where they compared all kinds of things related to rereading, and they found no effect. So there's good, consistent evidence that this is an approach that students use. So what we know from lots of studies, many studies in the lab, and now we say over a dozen course-based studies at UNH, it's probably more than that now. What we find in these studies is that actually rereading material is not an effective study strategy, particularly compared to certain other kinds of interventions. So the focus of what we're going to talk about here today, I'm going to give some background and maybe talk about one study, and Kathy will then talk about the others, is this notion of desirable difficulties. And desirable difficulties are learning activities that are designed to challenge learners. Right? They're likely to produce errors or mistakes. They're likely also to lead to more enduring retention and transfer of what you learn. All right? Now, we can do this in a variety of different ways. We can do it informally, sort of low stakes, if you will, which we could ask questions of students in class. I mean, if you were to assess students, and we've done some of this and other people have done it, is if you ask students what their druthers are, would you prefer that I ask you a question, where, especially overtly in class, where I try to get you to retrieve an answer? Or would you rather say, Victor, tell me what you want me to know? And I'll write it down, and then I'll go back and reread it over and over and over again and memorize it. We could have clickers of various kinds where we ask questions. We could do that. We could have students engage in problem-solving activities. We're not going to focus on this here today, but in problem-solving, a typical way in which problem-solving instruction goes on is that something happens, students read something, maybe teachers talk about something, they might do an example on the board, and then they give them homework. And in most textbooks, it's answer the odd questions, not the even ones, and the reason is the even ones have the answers. Isn't that the way books are structured? A lot of them, that's the way it used to be. And the odd ones don't, and so the students that have to do the odd problems, do them all, hand homework in, maybe somebody grades it. What we know actually from a lot of research on what's called the use of worked examples or worked solutions is that actually having the solutions worked out with appropriately structured solution steps described, actually, and having students only do either part of a problem or only some problems on their own, actually leads to better performance sometimes dramatic difference in performance on high-stakes exams. That is, students do better when they only did some of the work on their own versus it was scaffolded or supported by the solution worked out with an explanation of that. So that's a desirable difficulty, because if you'd ask students, that what they want to do, they sure would like you to give them the answers, but for the wrong reason. It's because they think it's easier. All right. In-class minute papers, this notion of formative assessment, classroom assessment techniques, very easy to implement. And another technique which we are going to talk about a little today, which is this notion of self-explaining. And self-explaining meaning is as you're reading academic material, or it could be listening to something, watching something, that if you either have a prompted, that is, I ask you some questions, or unprompted, where you try to explain what it is you've read, or saw, or listened to, is that is very difficult for students, and it's also time consuming. So it's definitely a difficulty, and what you'll see today, it can be extremely desirable in terms of the impact it has on learning. So more formally, we can just take many of these things and put stakes on them, right? So in-class quizzing, graded clicker questions, problem solving, graded question sets, graded writing assignments, different kinds of things that try to actually get students to do these things, to participate in these things, which we know are desirable, but that we know that if students are left to their druthers, they might choose something, not just simply because they think it's easier, but because, take rereading. It's a great example. You read something, you don't understand it. You read it again, you don't understand it. You read it again, and all of a sudden, a fluidity begins to happen. I already know what I'm going to read on the next page as I turn. You begin to anticipate because you have familiarity. And the notion, what rereading does is it creates a strong sense of familiarity, which leads to a sense that I'm learning. The trouble is, it makes things easier, or it gives the illusion that they're easier, but not so. A really excellent source on this is Clark and Bjork. Robert Bjork is a cognitive scientist, UCLA. I think he's retired now. He's the person that developed this notion of desirable difficulties. And in this book that Catherine and Chris and I edited several years ago, we have a chapter in there by Bjork, and I was a graduate student of his at the time. It's a really good chapter. Just a little plug here. What we think is one of the good things about this book is this is a book that we put together that's not for cognitive scientists, or even particularly for psychologists. It's for teachers. And so in other words, when the people wrote the chapters, they had to put it in language and lingo that was interesting and interpretable by a historian or a philosopher or a physicist, whatever. And you can get this book for free at this website. Chris will give you the link to it. So first, we're going to, when I say rereading is not as effective, what? Compared to what? You always want to know compared to what? Well, this phrase, retrieval-based learning, there are lots of ways that it's described. There's some controversy about the way it's described. But in our experience, meaning the research we've done, the use of retrieval practice, retrieval-based learning can be a very powerful tool in promoting the learning, particularly of certain kinds of material. I don't have a reference for it here, but if anybody's interested, I'd be happy to give it to you. It's the Ken Kadinger from Carnegie Mellon University has a wonderful paper which is called the KLI, the knowledge, learning, something, instruction model, there you go, in which what he shows very clearly is that the type of learning outcome that you're trying to achieve has to be informed in terms of the instruction that you use based on what kind of outcome it is. So in other words, if what you're trying to get students is to learn a lot of factual knowledge, right? We work a lot with faculty in anatomy and physiology. Those first two core courses, so a lot of facts that have to be learned. Our basic, our 2 introductory courses in biological science, big biology, small biology, particularly the first half of both of those semesters is loaded with facts. Retrieval practice is really a very powerful technique for that. If you're trying to get people to do higher order decision making and problem solving, retrieval practice is not so good at that. So you match the intervention to the kind of learning outcome you want. We talk about backward course design. What do you want students to know? How are you going to assess it? What activity are you going to do to support the development of that outcome? So retrieval practice, here are some of the different ways we talk about it. Test-enhanced learning, practice testing, self-testing, called the testing effect. And we already know, I've given you the hint, that actually giving people tests on what it is you want them to learn actually not only is a way to assess what they've learned, that's why we usually think of tests, it's the way we measure what students have learned. But we also know that it actually strengthens the development of the learning. It affects encoding, it affects retrieval, it affects transfer. That is what you've learned to something different, related but different. And we know that it also testing can have an indirect effect, which is, encourage you to study, give you feedback, could guide your future study and so on. But what we're interested in here are the learning benefits of testing. All right. So I'm going to give you an example of a project that we've done. And this is a faculty member in one of our engineering physical science departments. And he has a course on energy and environment that he's taught a number of times. And what he wanted to do with us is he wanted students to be in class. He wanted them to be paying attention to what was happening in class. And he wanted them to learn something from what was happening in class and be able to know and use what had happened in class later on. So we said, well, there's this work that we're really interested in. There's this physicist at Harvard, Eric Mazur, who is some kind of space physicist guy, laser physicist, but he's also an education research person, very interesting person. And he's developed something, he calls it peer instruction. It's kind of a misnomer, gives an impression, but what it basically involves is, for many years, Eric talked to all these Harvard students about Newton's laws, and he gives them exams, and they're Harvard students, they do really well. And then there's something called a force concept inventory, which measures, like, what do you really understand about Newtonian physics? And he gives it to his Harvard students, and squat. You go to another college, the professor does whatever, the students do whatever they do on the test, you give them the force concept inventory, they don't do so well. So Eric was finding that maybe the students at Harvard did better on exams, but in terms of core understanding of the concepts, they weren't doing so well. So he developed this technique where he would talk, he would ask students a question about Newtonian physics. We've been in an audience with Eric and made fools of ourselves trying to answer Newtonian physics questions. But the principle, the way it goes about it was very instructive. And he says something, asks the question to students, and then what he has the students do is he has them think for a little bit about what the answer, he gives them a question, puts it up on the board, they think a little bit, they click, they declare, and then he has them talk to each other, pair up, two, talk to each other. And so I think it's B, that thing goes around and you think it's A, and then you get this persuasion effect maybe that's going on. You get that. Then what you do is after it's done, we declare again, and Eric will present the results. And his rule of thumb is that if on the second, so she puts the first set of answers up, and let's say there are 4 choices, the average percent correct was 25%, and people were guessing. He goes through this routine, puts it up, it's 78%. All right, and he's done some studies that go into trying to identify what the components that might be contributing to that, but normally what he's done is sort of over many institutions with classes that have done this versus not done this. He looks at the effect size for on the force concept inventory, sort of how much better they do than chance, that kind of thing. And he finds an effect. So what we wanted to do is sort of take a variation of that and ask some questions. So what we wanted to know is, does clicking make any difference? When students are in a course where they purchase or they rent or they're given for free or whatever, they get this clicker thing. Teachers use these things for many reasons. One of the reasons they use them is to get information, data if you will, from their students, sometimes to show them a display on the board, some other kinds of things. Mazur wanted to do it so he could see what it looked like ahead of the intervention of discussion versus afterward. A presentation format, ask a related question, think about it for 30 seconds, click a response to a question, discuss with the peer, click again. All right? And that's Eric. Ours, very close to this, is we ask a question, and we do it in different presentation formats, though. Right? So we provide feedback afterward. So we have a click, peer-to-peer discussion click. That condition is exactly what I described you with Missouri. Okay? You ask the question, you click, talk to your neighbor, you click again, do that. We have another technique called click, think, click. So in this condition, get the question, you click, but now you just think on your own. You're not discussing. We have another one, which is think, peer-to-peer, think. So now what we're doing is we're asking, with the standard comparison, is there any benefit of declaring your answer with a clicker? You could also think about this in economic terms. In other words, students have to buy a clicker. That's money that they're spending, or somebody's spending, for the clicker. Is there any benefit of that? Maybe other than you get to record it on some device to show it, but is there any learning benefit of making that kind of declaration? Maybe there might be some benefit of just thinking a little bit more. We didn't think so. And then we might have a question that we wanted to ask, but we didn't. We just held it back. All right? So I'm not going to go into details about this further. There are lots of experimental design questions and issues and so on. But basically, what we do is we do this leading up to the first major exam, this kind of intervention. In this case, we did a different intervention on different days. On another study we did all interventions on one day, different variations that we've done. We create exam questions that are linked to these conditions. And then on the exam, students answer, and then later we get the data, and we go and look and see how they did on questions related to these different conditions. Got it? So here's an example. The questions that we had talked in class about, I don't want you to even study this, but look at it. I just want you to know that on the exam we asked a related question, conceptual question, but we're not asking them the same thing over and over. And you see it's just a different kind of question. They're transfer questions of various kinds. So the results. So question that we had in the bag but we didn't ask in class on the midterm exam, questions related to that, we got about 70%. Some error bar, confidence interval around that. Here's the standard Mazur click, discuss, click. And there it is. So having this retrieval practice of this kind, I mean, we had, almost like an 8-point or 9-point difference on the exam, questions related to that. Now, what about discussing? Does discussing have some additional impact over just thinking about it on your own? I mean, that's the reason he had people do it with peers. Anybody a social psychologist in here? Well, let me just tell you what happens when two people get together. I mean, if I had to have a discussion here with Chris about this principle, he would be arguing like crazy with me. And maybe I'm the kind of person that would be persuaded by his arguing, and maybe I'm not, and maybe, right? So who knows what's going on? We found no difference whatsoever. And we think what's going on is sometimes it's facilitative, and sometimes it's not, it cancels out. Here's the bottom line: thinking, discussing, think. There it is. So not clicking and thinking more. More thinking actually had this effect, this mean, if you do a significance test, or you could just look at confidence intervals, if you look at that, it's different than all of these other conditions. It's clearly hugely different from here, but there's a benefit in this case of not using a piece of technology. We have another study. I'm just going to show you the result. I'm not even going to talk about the details. This is the one where we manipulated everything within a class. We didn't use the control condition, and we got it again. All right? We've talked, again, with psychology people at lunch about sometimes how individual differences make a difference in learning. We've done individual differences in two ways. One is that we look at students, how they do overall on an assessment, and just say look at the top half or the bottom half. That is, overall, the students that did above the average on the exam, students that below the average, and then look how they do as a function of our intervention. And so other times what we'll do is we'll take SAT scores. Sometimes, let's say it's a math class, it might be SAT math or whatever. Maybe sometimes it's both. Biology, I think we use total, verbal, and math, SAT, as an individual difference. The question here is, do all students benefit the same? Well, here's the high-performing students in this first class that I showed you the results for of 99 students. I have no idea what I've done. Help? What did I do?
It's gone. It's gone.
Well, I thought it would touch. Yeah. Okay. We get lost the magic there. See, we find the same effect, but look at, these are the top performing. For the bottom performing students on that exam, right there, look at the difference between there and there. It's 20 points. A 20-point difference. Just a general point, Kathy will show you some results also. A general point is that in much of the work we do, in fact, in most of the work that we do, the interventions that we have, that as long as students do them, now the question of motivation, if they do it on their own, and maybe many of them wouldn't, and the high-performing students would do it whether you made them do it or not, but the low-performing students, if you can get them to do the activity the way we do it, which is we give stakes associated with completing this work, is that small stakes, is that the benefits are the greatest for the students that need it the most. And so that's an educationally important finding, we think, because what it shows is that, when you come from the cognition laboratory, the basic way that cognitive scientists do their lab work is you try to find an intervention that's going to, whack things really and have this huge impact, and it wipes out any individual differences, and, it's just this powerful main effect. But in the educational setting, there's variability, noise, if you will, experimental and otherwise, all over the place. And so if we can look at individual differences in a way that's going to try to see where the impact is greater. It's not hurting these people. In fact, it's benefiting them. But I have psychic fingers, Chris. Is that it's benefiting them, but it's not benefiting them as much as for the low-skilled people.
Okay, I'm going to talk about the next two studies that we did in classroom settings. The next two studies have to do with a grant that we had, Davis Educational Foundation grant, on STEM retention. And so these are in the sciencey kind of areas. However, they can be used anywhere. But the ones that we're going to show today are both from biology. So this one here is a study that we did in biology. There were 176 students who completed the entire program. So we eliminated those who only completed part of it. They didn't do all the days that were required. So 176 did them all. And it's a flashcard study. And what we were interested in was that a lot of students use flashcards, and it turns out there's a particular way that students use flashcards that's not terribly effective for learning, but there's a better way. And the study that we did was based on a laboratory study by Nate Cornell that showed that if students study in this particular way, they will do better. So it was in 2009, spacing versus cramming. Another way that students study often is that they will cram their study just before the exam. They do that for two reasons. Number one, it's economic in time. And number two, it works for that immediate exam. They do just as well as students who study over time. The preferred way in terms of performance, students do better if they study over time. But on the exam, there's really very little difference in performance between the two methods of study. Where the difference does pronounce is on a long-term retention. So on a cumulative exam or on a follow-up course where they need to use the material from a previous course, they do better if they distribute their study over time. And so this flashcard experiment looked at the notion of studying distributively or massing your study. When you mass your study and it happens just before the exam, it's called cramming. So what he used in the laboratory was GRE pair words. So students would come into a laboratory, a very tight situation, and he had students use flashcards in the same way they would do it if they were doing it on their own. So they didn't have to say the answers. They would just look at the flashcard and they would think their answers and they'd move on to a prescribed method of distribution of these cards. So GRE, vocabulary, word pairs. Each study session took place over 4 days before the exam, in the laboratory on these GRE vocabulary words. There was a day gap, and we played with whether or not that was necessary, but he had a day gap where students were taking the day off and they could just study as they wanted to study just before the exam on day 6. So what we did, he used 40 items, we did 32 items. We've done various numbers of items to test for effectiveness of this intervention. This particular study, we used 32 items. Half of them were what we call spaced. That is, they reviewed each of those items twice on every day for 4 days before the exam. The second half of the items, 16 items, were massed. And they were massed, doing my math in my head, they had 4 items on day 1, and then another 4 items on day 2, another 4 items on day 3, and another 4 items on day 4. And we in the center randomly assigned the cards to a particular condition. So the teacher just gave us the information bits that he wanted them to know, and we took care of all of the assignments. So for the first 16 items, every item was studied twice on each of the 4 days for a total of 8 study opportunities per item. The second items, there were 4 blocks, each comprising 4 unique items per block. Each block of items was studied on a different day, so on day 1, they didn't study those on day 2 or 3 or 4. They just they crammed their study all on that day. But as it happens, they had the same amount of study time as the spaced items. So every single card, every single item on those 32 items were studied 8 times. Okay? It's just the pattern of when they were studied. So that was our sequence based on Nate Cornell's. We used authentic course material, of course. He used GRE word pairs. We used what the teacher wanted them to know. We also had the teacher write transfer questions for those items, those flashcard items. The other difference is that because we were doing this online, we weren't in a laboratory, we weren't watching every single student. what we did was we had them fill out their flashcard questions on the Qualtrics, which is our survey device. And so we had the question, and then they clicked, and they had to write in their answer. So we forced them to write in their answer. If they didn't write answers, they wouldn't get credit for it. If they wrote gibberish, like some people did, they wouldn't get credit for it. So they actually had to write in a thoughtful response every time. And it's amazing because you could actually see the learning happening when you download this huge Excel file. You could see that they were getting it. So 176 students completed all 4 flashcard days, and which is pretty amazing because Qualtrics allows you to time how long it takes them in that system, and they were taking about an hour and a half to do this. So every day for an hour and a half, they were doing this. Within subject design, which means that all students experienced all conditions. So all students experienced the mass and the spacing. It's just that what item that was. We also randomly assign students to have massed item first, or spaced items first, or spaced or massed. So we varied that as well behind the scenes. Those are the conditions. Okay, good. So 4 days of study. I think they had a day off. I'm not sure about this one. It doesn't really matter because we got the same results no matter what. So what we did initially was we looked at the transfer questions on the exam, which we coded, and we looked at how students did overall on the 16 massed items that were transfer questions versus the 16 spaced items. And what we found is about a 75% correct on transfer questions for those questions that were in the massed condition. And for those questions that were transfer questions in the spaced condition, we got that. So pretty significant results. You can see here about 15 points better just because those items were studied twice every day for 4 days. But pretty interesting and important, I think, results showing the benefit of distributed study over time. Some people ask about this, and I think this is very interesting to look at. So when you separate out those items into, these are all the spaced items, and here are items that are presented on day 1, they never saw them again. Items on day 2, never saw them again, and so forth. And you can see, those of us who are psychologists, a primacy and recency effect. But it doesn't matter because none of those, even they're powerful results, not as good as the spaced. So the spaced items really work better. And in consultation with this teacher, and we always have the consultations initially to find out what is their learning need. So with this particular teacher, we said, okay, we have a number of things that we could do. What is your learning need? And his learning need was that students needed to learn a lot of stuff. They needed to learn details and facts and that sort of thing. And this certainly was a great intervention for his course. We've also done this in anatomy and physiology. Big sections, there were 600 students from, I think, 3 sections from the same teacher. We find consistently the same results. We varied conditions, we varied items, we controlled for difficulty, we've done any number of things. We've been doing this how long now? 3-4 years in varying courses, and we get always consistent results like this. So that was that. And so another study that we did in a biology course was something called self-explanation. And this is something that we've been, it's a new one to us, self-explanation. And I was interested in pursuing this because it just seemed intriguing to me, and it was so far removed from what we had already been doing. And from what we could find, there wasn't a lot of in vivo experiments being done. There was no real authentic classroom situation where this activity was being at least written up that we could find. And so in a laboratory, what happens is that there's an experimenter, there's the student, and it's one-on-one. The student reads a sentence and explains it out loud to the experimenter and so forth. And we obviously couldn't do that in a classroom. So we had to figure out a way that we could do it, and I'll describe it that way in just a minute. So again, this is a biology course. There were 148 students who completed all of the assignments. And what it was when we consulted with him, his learning issue was, gee, you know what, I would really like to have students come into class having read the textbook, being ready to discuss, being prepared. What can you do for me? And I said, I have the perfect thing for you. This is what I'd like to do. I think it's going to work. And we can't sit with them one-on-one, 148, actually there were 200 students in the class, but that many completed all the assignments. And so what we did was we looked at his textbook and we saw that there were certain, there were chapters in the textbook, and inside each chapter there were part 1, part 2, part 3, part 4, and so forth. And self-explanation works best when you take a little piece of the information and you explain it. Then you take a little piece of the information and you explain it. So we used the way the textbook was laid out to help us with the strategy. And so, what is it? Well, it's a constructive learning activity. It's an active learning activity, but mostly it's constructive because the students actually construct their own knowledge. It's self-monitoring. What it does is it helps to promote students sort of reviewing the new material, relating to what they already know, relating the new material to what they already know about it, and it helps them to build a new understanding based on missing pieces, based on correcting their misinformation and so forth. We know that one of the most important predictors of student performance is their prior knowledge. But we also know that prior knowledge can be incomplete, it can be wrong, and it can be just sort of nothing, it can be nothing at all. And so this helps them to correct those gaps, those missing areas. Okay. So we had them read the textbook chapter, and we had them to respond to prompts after each chapter section. And we had them do this on our online learning system, our LMS, and we did it as an assignment. And so we had an assignment for every chapter. Every chapter had 1 or 7 areas that they had to respond to, depending on how many sections there were in each chapter. And they had to respond to some prompts. The first prompt was, describe the information that is new to you in this area that you just read. The second prompt is, how do these ideas work with what you already know? Again, having them think about what they already knew about it. It could have been in the last chapter they read, it could have been in a lecture they heard, it could have been in a previous class, or it could have been something that they just knew coming in. And why do these examples work together? Provide an example, and this takes them beyond. It helps them to develop some critical thinking about the material. It helps them to instantiate the material into a particular setting. And then we ask them to list 2 what I call I wonder questions, which is questions that they have that take them beyond the reading, not just I didn't understand that, or why do I have to do this kind of thing, which we've got some of those. But mostly the questions were really inspiring. They were really, really good questions that they had to respond to. We had to compare it to something to see if it worked. And so what we did was behind the scenes, we divided the students up into 2 sections. One section got the self-explanation prompts. Another section got the, summarize the material with no prompting. Summarize the material you just read. That's it. Summarize the material you just read. Okay. And then we had the teacher write questions on the exam. We coded them to were they in section 1, section 2, section 3, what chapter they were in, and so forth. And of course we knew what students were in what conditions. The reason why this is a desirable difficulty is because it takes time. It takes time to do it. Okay, so there we go. So these are the results from students who are in the summary condition versus those students who are in the self-explanation condition. And self-explanation did better. It doesn't look like they did better by much. I mean, they just made it to significance. And so I was a little disheartened by this. I mean, I was happy that it worked, But after I sat back and reflected on what I'm saying here, what I understand is that summarizing is better than nothing. So they're doing something to help their learning just by summarizing the material. We didn't have a condition where they did nothing, but we were doing that now because I'm really interested in that. But anyway, so this is better than nothing. And also, I thought, well, I wonder if it differentially benefits some students, but not others. And so, like Victor said, we looked at their background ability. And I think this time we looked at their SAT scores. Yeah, SAT scores. And so what we found is we took SAT scores coming into the university, and we divided them into thirds, the upper third, the lower third of the SAT scores. And we found that the high performers, or the high SAT students, did well no matter what you gave them. They just did it. But the low SAT score students benefited more than the high performers. And I think that this is what washed out our results. And we got just barely significant. But as you can see, that it really benefits them. Can you count that? It's about
9 points.
how many?
9.
9 or 10 points. So about a letter grade better for those students. That's it.
So we have some time for some questions if you want, I think, but we have till 3. Yeah. Just if I could say one thing about, we used summarization as the control condition and the self-explanation. There's a literature that shows that summarization is an effective technique. So in some ways, we've sort of putting our arm, with our arm tied behind our back, making it a little more difficult. And as Kathy said, if we just had as a control condition what students would normally do on their own, that the effect of self-explanation might even be larger.
So we're doing this in a physics class with their textbook, and in a humanities class, Greek mythology, and they have different readings. And we've added that third condition, which is just read it as you normally would read it. But they're all assignments, they all get credit for it. But the students who just do their own thing just say, I read it as I normally would read it, and they don't have to do anything else.
Time for questions, comments, thoughts?
Yep.
So I have the benefit of speaking with you earlier, so I'm sorry this derails it just slightly. I'm curious about those 52 people who didn't finish the assignment. So there are 200 people in that class, you had 148, and some of those benefited. What do you do with those 52?
Right. I didn't put it in this slide right here, but for the flashcard, I used to have a slide, which is probably somewhere in here, that looked at students who completed less than 4 days, so 3 or fewer days of the flashcard experiment, compared to those who completed all 4 days. And they did less well, significantly less well.
And to be dropped out, all they had to even do is not do one of the days.
Right.
Just so that we had the same people throughout. That's what, for this, we decided to do it. But it sort of, maybe this is the thrust of your point, is that, we do this with faculty trying to, we can't make students do it. We can make it more likely, because we already know, we talked about this at lunch too, somebody did a set of assignments where, do it, it's good for you, eat your spinach, and maybe 30% of the people did it, and then put some stakes on it, and now not only are they doing it, they're handing it in early, they're getting it done. And what we find, when we work, we really, I don't know that if we're going to do a project like this where we are collecting data, we're trying to add to the base of knowledge, we want to publish this so other people can benefit, we're not going to work with you if you don't put stakes on things. If you don't want to do that, that's your business and so on, but we're not going to work with you because we know that there's, whatever it might be, 20% or 30% of the students aren't going to do this stuff, and because we're able to do this because of this grant we have. We were just a teaching and learning center that was supported by our university. This is time intensive, right? So we put money into these grants to buy out people's time to focus on this, so we have to do it. But so a whole other question, Chris, you're interested in this, is which has not been our focus, but there are lots of things that aren't. is how can we increase the motivation, if you will, or increase the behavioral output of students? You know, I mean, we're doing it by putting stakes on it, but you know, there might be other ways to do it. There's a lot of stuff about intrinsic motivation and so on. All that's really valuable. I mean, it's not been our focus, but
No, although we do work with faculty in two ways. This is one way. Another
Yes.
way is just implement. So if they want to know,
right.
I have a problem, what can I do? They might have a small course, or they're probably not interested in doing a project like this.
Right.
Then we know testing effect works. We say do quizzing, or whatever it is appropriate for their learning outcomes. I'll give you an example. I am working right now with a person who teaches about 30 students in her course. It's a communications course, and she came to me because the students just aren't, it's an upper level class, so it's a senior level course. It's a capstone course, and students are just not coming to class prepared. There's readings and they have discussion, but most of the class is like a seminar class, but they're just not prepared for it. And I said, well, you know, we've done this self-explanation and we've been finding some good results. Maybe you could implement that. And so I gave her the tools to do it. And I said, let me know about halfway, how is it going? Well, she's already written back to me saying, this has been fabulous. She said that discussions are more engaged, they're more dynamic. She said, and they've already had their first exam, and I see a 10-point boost on their exams already from the many years before that she's taught this course. And so we do have great anecdotal information about just simple implementations where the teachers can look back to their past and see a difference.
I think the interesting point is to try to go, and I see translation almost in 3 steps. So you have the lab science, and you have the classroom science, and then you have that implementation piece in the classroom. And that's the piece that's challenging, because sometimes the effects are subtle, and so you might see a benefit for some students and not others.
Right.
And so, and we talked about this before too, as a risk taking when you want to try something different in the classroom. And sometimes the risk-taking is beneficial for that low-performing group, and the high-performing group might even not do quite as well. So it really is, it becomes more challenging. But I do think that the more people know about these kinds of strategies and the effectiveness of them, they can try to find strategies that might work for their content, who they are as an instructor, and the way their students are interacting, to try to find pieces that will work with them. So.
I had a question about the clickers. Hi. So you had the click, discuss, click, but then the think, discuss, think was way better.
Right.
Like,
We added that as a control.
I'm baffled by that.
I know.
And like, well, it would kind of, I can't envision, because I use clickers in my class, I can't envision how you get them to just think without, because I give them points for participation to do it, like you said, like.
I know.
And like, I'm envisioning, like I have like 60 people in my class, I did just think and discuss, think again, I feel like it would just go off the rails.
Right, and so when we did it the first time we got that result, it was a complete shock. We did not expect to see that because we had that as a control.
Yeah.
And so the teacher said, well, you know, we're doing all of these strategies, these presentation strategies in the same class. Maybe it happened that it just randomly fell that these were harder classes or these were easier classes or whatever. And so what we did for the next study was we did all presentation styles in the same class.
Mm-hmm.
So to control for class difficulty.
Mm-hmm.
And we found it again, we found the replication. And so there's something about it. I have a theory about that. Is what I think it is that once students click, it's almost like they have declared. And I think it's a psychological thing. So they have declared their answer. And so it's going to be very hard for them to change their mind even if they're wrong. But if they're thinking, maybe there's still some evolution of thought, so they can then go ahead and change their mind. They can feel more free to change their mind. I think there's something about clicking that sets it.
Anchor effect.
Yeah, huh?
It's the anchor effect.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anchoring effect. Anchoring effect, yeah. I'm not even a social psychologist.
I'm a social psychologist.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, folks. Thanks for coming. Thank you.